This is looking pretty good. Time to keep going with this build. Let's get into this. Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Thanks so much for tuning in. Now, today's video we're going to continue on with the build of my Tamiya DT-03 Racing Fighter. In the last video I actually went through parts bag A and assembled everything pertaining to that. Now if you want to watch that video, I'll leave a link in the cards up above and I'll leave a link in the description down below. Now fair warning, if you do check out that video, it is a long one, so make sure you've got a drink and maybe your favorite snacks ready before you actually settle into it. Today though, we're going through parts bag B. Now, in an effort to sort of keep this video a little bit on the shorter side, I've already gone ahead and cut all the parts off of the various sprues that we're going to use, as well as organized all the fasteners that are pertaining to parts bag B. Now, before I actually get into this, there's a couple things I did want to mention that have changed since the first video, and that is the Tamiya hop-up option turnbuckle steering rods here. If you watch the first video, you'll notice that when I first put together the turnbuckle set, I didn't realize that the Tamiya hop-up option actually included not only the upper links but also the steering arms as well. So after I finished that video, I put those together and I installed them on the vehicle. Now the other thing that I did was I actually installed Tamiya's high torque servo saver as well. That was something that I had actually attempted to install during this build, during the last video, but it didn't actually work out, so I ended up not filming that bit. However, I did manage to figure out how to do it. You know, it requires a slight change to the orientation of the servo saver itself, so that's actually installed in the vehicle now. So those are the two things that have actually changed since the last video. So let's get into parts bag B. Now for parts bag B, for a majority of it, we're not actually going to need the chassis assembly as you see it here. So I'm going to set this aside while we get into parts bag B. All right, so parts bag B actually starts with step 14. Now step 14 requires that we build the differential itself. Now to do that, we need the differential gear case, the differential cover, as well as a number of metal parts, including a star shaft right there, 2 large bevel gears, and 3 smaller bevel gears right there. Now, in my case, and for my particular build, I'm not actually going to be going with the kit differential. Instead, I've opted for the Tamiya hop-up options ball differential set. You can see right here, this is kit number 53863. Now, don't let the packaging fool you. It says DT-02. This will actually work for either DT-02 or the DT-03. Now, before we get into this, I want to have a little word about the actual differential itself, both the kit and this ball diff. Now, if you're planning to do your own DT-03 build, there's absolutely nothing wrong with using the kit supplied differential. The kit differential itself is actually very, very stout. It is a very strong unit and will put up with a lot of abuse. So if you decide to go with brushless power, this differential will definitely take that power. The reason why I'm going with a ball differential is because ball differentials actually act like a limited slip differential when it's in your car. Now, to explain what that means, a gear differential is effectively like an open differential. So what happens is if you've got a situation where one wheel is losing traction where the other one has traction, the differential itself will not actually route power to the wheel that it has traction. And instead, you'll end up actually losing all that power because it's just getting sent to the wheel that's losing all the traction. A ball differential, on the other hand, as I said, acts like a limited slip. So if you've got a situation where one wheel is slipping, the ball differential will actually route power to the wheel that has traction, helping you kind of get out of a situation where you might be, fishtailing, or in a situation where the car might, just be losing traction. So there's an advantage to use ball differentials. So these are the big reasons why I ended up going with a ball differential set as opposed to the stock differential that Tamiya includes with their kit. But like I said, there's absolutely no shame in using the stock differential. And in fact, there has been, or I have heard of some sort of debates online where some folks say that ball differentials will not handle the same level of power as the gear differential that comes in the kit. Now, I don't have any quantifiable proof that shows one way or the other, but in my case, if I do have any issues with the ball differential itself, I can always revert back to installing the gear differential set that came with this kit into my car. So let's get this thing open and actually put this together. All right, so let's get into the build of the Tamiya hop-up option 53863 ball differential set. Okay, so taking a look at the ball differential instructions, it's a two-sided sheet. This is the first side, and this is the second side. So we start, looks like we start on this side here. So, first step is going to be to take the differential spur gear. They give you a nice Allen key. Leave that off to the side. The kit also includes ball diff grease, Tamiya ball diff grease. Look at that. So the assembly starts with the differential spur gear in this orientation. So if we take a look at it, there's sort of a deep side and a shallow side. So the shallow side stays up during this part of the assembly. And in this bag, we have a series of small ball bearings. So each ball bearing gets placed in one of these holes. These are 3mm ball bearings. Whoops. Now be careful when you do assemble these things. These ball bearings can go all over the place, and that would be disastrous if you lost any of them. So if you do assemble your own, be really careful. Okay, so that there are all the ball bearings carefully placed within the spur gear itself. Now, the instructions call for application of ball diff grease. So, see if we can't do that very carefully. Puncture the tube. Whoops. And as you'd expect, whole bunch of ball diff grease just came pouring out. Now, very carefully, apply the ball diff grease to each ball. All right. So that is the spur gear with all the ball bearings installed and greased. Now on to the next step. Now, in this case, we're going to get into some of the thrust bearings. And when you're assembling this, it is very important to note the direction of some of these disc springs. So let me get into this right now. See if I can't show you guys how this is going to go together. So, according to the instructions, we're going to start with the step bolt. Now the step bolt itself will have 3 disc springs. The first one gets mounted in this orientation. The second gets mounted in the opposite orientation. And then the third gets mounted in the same orientation as the first. Now, I've already sort of made a mistake. Let me back that up. This requires a little bit of grease to be applied. So we'll do that right now. Good. Then, first thrust washer with the cup facing upward. Second 5mm thrust washer with the cup facing downward. And then the third 5mm cup washer with the cup facing upward. Then the ball thrust bearing goes on top of that. And then the smaller 4mm disc spring with the cup facing upward. And then the second disc spring with the cup facing downward. So that brings us now to the next bag in this ball differential assembly. Which includes the drive cups, short and long, and pressure plates. This is pressure plate B. We have large thrust washer, pressure plate A. We no longer need that. So we move on to this part of the assembly. So according to this, we take our assembly here. We take pressure plate A and we place it on top of the little assembly that we just made. Then we take one of our thrust washers. We apply grease. The thrust washer goes on top. Pressure plate A. Then we take our differential spur gear assembly, put that on top. Then we take our second thrust washer. Now before I go ahead, what I am going to do is I'm going to lift this off, because according to the instructions they show that what you should do is you should put this entire assembly onto the Allen key, I guess so that you can hold it. Then take all of this, put it on top. Then we take our thrust washer. Now, thrust washer calls for grease, again, both sides. And the thrust washer goes on top there. Then we take pressure plate B, that goes on top. And then the short gear shaft fits in. And this is the complete assembly right here. So that shows us the complete assembly of the ball differential. Now, obviously I have to take these drive cups off in order to actually install it in the transmission, but this gives you an idea of what the complete ball differential assembly actually looks like. That now completes step 14. So step 15 has us installing the gear differential into the actual transmission casing itself. So this calls for A1, part A1, which came off of one of the sprues. It also calls for counter gear, this piece right here. It also calls for two plastic bushings. Now, anyone who's built a Tamiya kit already knows that Tamiya is notorious for including these plastic bushings in place of bearings. Now, in my case, I will not be using these plastic bushings, and anyone who builds a Tamiya kit, the very first thing that anyone will tell you is to make sure you buy a set of full ball bearings before you even start. And the reason why is because some of these bushings end up deep into the bowels of the actual vehicle, and it becomes a real pain to replace them later on. So I will not be using these plastic bushings in my build, and instead I have opted for a set of full ball bearings. These are Fast Eddie brand ball bearings. Purchased these on eBay. They're relatively inexpensive, but I have heard great reviews about Fast Eddie bearings. I've never used Fast Eddie bearings before. I'm not affiliated with them in any way, but I do know that they make great bearings, and this is the set for the DT-03 chassis. There's no part number on this, but if you do a search on eBay, I'm sure they'll come up. So let's get into this. So for step 15, we're calling for two ball bearings, not the plastic bearings. In addition, it also calls for this steel shaft. Now, this is the kit supplied steel shaft, and you can see it's basically a solid metal shaft. I'm not going to be going with these. As you'd expect, I have opted for the Tamiya hop-up option DT-03 lightweight gear shaft. In this case, this is kit number or part number 54560. Now this is effectively still just a steel shaft, but with the center drilled out for lighter weight. So this is what I'm going to be going with, and step 15 calls for one of those. So lighter weight, and I can tell you just by holding the two, yeah, there's a significant weight difference between the two. So as far as I'm concerned, a very worthwhile upgrade. Now, starting with this, one bearing first gets pushed into this end of the shaft, or sorry, of the counter gear. The instructions call for grease. Now, in this case, I'm going to use the kit supplied Tamiya grease. Let's get that open. All right, so I'm going to apply a little bit of this stuff on the counter gear. And then a second bearing gets installed on this end of the counter gear. Good. Now, the instructions call for grease to be applied to the gear shaft itself. However, applying grease to this is only really beneficial if you decide to use the plastic bushings that come with the kit. In this case, because I'm using bearings, it really isn't necessary, so I'm not going to bother putting grease on this. And the lightweight gear shaft fits perfectly right in. Good. Spread a little bit of the grease around, make sure it gets everywhere before I insert it into transmission casing. Good. And now this gets installed, and I hope you guys can see it, but there's a small hole right there. It'll actually get installed right on that. Done. Perfect. So that is step 15. All right, so step 16 now has us actually assembling the two halves of the gearbox itself. So step 16 requires two bearings. The instructions call for plastic bushings, but we're using bearings, and four 3x10mm tapping screws. Now, the parts you'll need, of course, is the half of the gearbox that we've just finished assembling. We're also going to need part number A3, which is the second half of the gearbox. And we're also going to need the differential gear that we just finished assembling. Now, this is, of course, the ball drive gear, differential gear. Now, one thing I didn't mention earlier, which I do need to mention with respect to the ball drive, and this is another reason why you might want to consider going with a ball drive, is because it is adjustable. So you can actually adjust the tension of the ball drive such that if you fully tighten it up, it effectively acts like a locked differential, or almost like a spool. So both wheels will get the same amount of power, and there really won't be much of differential activity between the two wheels. Or you can loosen it. Now, according to the instructions, loose is considered sort of a half turn, and it'll loosen up and it'll actually act more like a differential. Now, in order to do that, the way to do it is you have to pull the drive cup out of the one side. You use the Allen wrench. This is an Allen wrench that was included with the ball drive diff. You insert into this end, and then you can use another Allen wrench, sort of insert it in the other drive cup and just hold it, and use it to sort of tighten up the ball diff till it's basically fully tight. And that will, like I said, that'll effectively turn this into a locked differential, or you can turn it back half a turn, which is what I'm going to do with mine, and that will sort of open up the differential and make it operate like a standard diff. Now, that's how I'm going to leave mine for now, but again, it is adjustable, so it's something that can be changed later on. Now, I'm going to leave these off to the side. This now has to be installed in the gearbox itself, and the way it goes in, as we can see here in the instructions, you'll notice this shows the sort of the kit differential with the diff cover sort of facing outward, you know, up and away, and that is where this end will actually face out. So this end actually goes into the gearbox, this end actually faces out. Now before I do put this in, let me set this to the side for just a moment, because I need to install one of the bearings into the differential, or sorry, the gearbox case itself. So you can see that one of the bearings has gone in there. The instructions call for Tamiya grease to be spread on the actual differential itself. So I'm going to use the kit supplied grease. And this slides in and meshes. And then the second ball bearing goes into part A3, the other gearbox half. And then this goes into, mates up with the other half of the gearbox, and we use the 4 3x10mm screws to hold everything together. So now the two halves of the gearbox are now assembled, and that effectively completes step number 16. Good. All right, so now on to step 17. Now let me move the gearbox out of the way for a little bit. So step 17 actually involves setting up the motor and the spur gear so that they can be mated together and then ultimately added to the gearbox itself. So for step 17, we're going to need two, again, the instructions call for plastic bearings, but we're using bushings, so we're going to need two bushings, or bearings. It calls for the one metal drive shaft. Again, in my build, we're going with the lightweight Tamiya hop-up option drive shafts. It also calls for BB10, which is the motor plate. And we need to bring in the spur gear, which again is, comes included with the kit. And in this case, we can go ahead and actually assemble this bit. So one of the bearings goes in on one end. The other bearing goes in on the other end. There they are. And we insert the lightweight drive shaft. Now, again, if you look at the instructions, they tell you that the shaft itself should be greased. Again, if you're using the plastic bushings, that's important because the bushings themselves, the shaft itself actually rotates within the bushings. But because I'm using bearings, I don't need to actually worry about the grease. So I'm just going to go ahead and input that in like that. So that bit of step 17 is now complete. So we'll set that aside. Now, the next part of step 17 calls for you to take the motor and put the motor plate onto the motor itself. Now, my particular DT-03 came with the torque-tuned brushed motor. The kit that I bought, the particular version of the DT-03 Racing Fighter that I bought, did come with a few upgrades direct from Tamiya, and this is one of those upgrades. Normally, you would get just a standard 540 silver can motor, but in this case I have a torque-tuned motor. Now, generally speaking, the torque-tuned motors are actually really quite good motors, and they would provide probably very ample performance for a DT-03. However, I've decided not to go with the stock brush motor, and instead I've opted for a much higher end brushless TBLM-02S 10.5 turn censored brushless motor. Now this is a motor from Tamiya, and much like the servo that I've installed in this is probably a bit overkill for a vehicle like this. However, I've never actually had anything brushless. This is going to be my very first brushless motor and very first brushless vehicle. So I thought, well, you know what? Why not? I should mention the 10.5 turn brushless motor, the included ESC that comes with the DT-03 10.5 turn is the highest rating that ESC will accept. Tamiya does offer brushless motors with lower turn numbers, meaning a higher performance level. However, to facilitate that, I would need to swap out the ESC with a better one, and frankly I didn't want to do that. I want to stick with the kit supplied ESC, at least for the time being. So this is the motor we're going with. I haven't even opened it yet, so let's open it up right now. The TBLM-02S 10 turned censored brushless motor from Tamiya. This is what's going into my DT-03 Racing Fighter. 3 wires. You can see the sensor connector goes in there. I'm actually really excited about this. All right, so let me get some of this stuff out of the way. All right, so this is the TBLM-02S brushless 10.5 turn motor, and as per the instructions, we are supposed to use this motor plate. In this case, the motor itself has 6 holes on this end, unlike the brushed counterpart, which would typically only have 2 holes, so it's very easy to sort of figure out where this plate would go. So I don't think it really matters in this case. I'm just going to leave it like this for the time being and effectively call step 17 finished. All right, so now we're on to step 18. Now, step 18 calls for us to attach the motor to the gearbox itself as well as the spur gear. Now, in order to do that, we are going to require 2 3x6mm screws. We're going to need 1 3mm grub screw and the kit provided 17 tooth pinion gear. Now, in my case, I'm not actually going to be using the 17 tooth pinion gear. Instead, I've opted for the Tamiya hop-up option number 54629. This is the, I believe, 19 tooth steel spur gear. You can see right there. Now, I've opted for this for a couple of different reasons. Now, the 19 tooth gear will actually give a higher top speed, So it'll actually take a little bit of the acceleration away and actually give you a higher top end speed. And going with the steel pinion gear will actually maximize the life longevity of the gear itself. It's sort of common knowledge that the kit provided aluminum, and that's what this is, aluminum 17 tooth gear. I mean, the 17 tooth will give a slightly higher acceleration rate at the loss of sort of high end, top end speed, but the fact that this is aluminum, it doesn't last quite as long as the steel pinion gears. And most people will tell you that one of the first upgrades that you should do whenever building a Tamiya kit is to upgrade the pinion gear to a steel variant. And this is the genuine Tamiya version as well. So we're gonna go with this in this build. So first things first, let's get this thing out of the bag. All right, so we got the steel spur gear out of its bag along with its 3mm grub screw. We're ready to go. So first things first is the motor has to go into the gearbox. Now I should mention, again, this is shown in the instructions, depending on which gear you decide to use, there are holes here that are indicated. Two sets of holes, this hole here and this hole here, are for the 17 tooth pinion, and this hole here and the one across from it are for the 19 tooth pinion. So when you assemble the gearbox, you need to ensure that you're using the correct holes when you line up the motor, because that will actually cant the motor a little bit and give clearance for the correct pinion, or the pinion that you've decided to use. So in my case, I'm going with the 19 tooth. So I'll be using that hole there and that hole there. All right. So the motor is now installed in the gearbox. So the next step is to install the spur gear. Now the instructions do call for some grease to be added on the inside gear, so let's do that right now. All right. So we now have grease on the inside pinion, or the inside gear on the spur. That then makes its way in here. So that's now installed. And it's directly driving the differential. And so now, the next step is to install the actual pinion itself. Now, the grub screw itself that came with the pinion will make its way into that little hole there. Not sure you guys can see that, but there it is. And that needs to be on the flat bit of the motor shaft itself. You can see, I hope you guys can see that. So the flat section of the shaft that's coming out of the motor, that's where your grub screw needs to land. So let's do that right now. All right. Okay. And the instructions do tell you, they do sort of indicate here just where or how to place the pinion itself. You want it to be right onto the spur gear You don't want it to be too low, you don't want to be too high, you want it to be right on the spur gear itself before you put the grub screw in. In fact, you know what? Let me take that off. Put the grub screw on first. A little bit of a trick. Drive the grub screw, put the grub screw into pinion gear itself. Don't go all the way with it, of course, just thread it on a couple of threads just to get it started so you have it in place. And then put it onto the shaft itself, the motor shaft that is, and then thread it into spur gear. Once you have it lined up, which is exactly how I want it, like that, you tighten up the grub screw. Let's see if you guys can see that. All right, so that's how you want your pinion seated in relation to the spur gear. So now I'm just going to go ahead, tighten up the grub screw itself. And there it is. Pinion installed and meshed nicely with the spur gear. You can see that right there, just as the instructions say. And that completes step 18. All right, now on to step 19. Now step 19 is actually fairly easy. It calls for three by 10 millimeter tapping screws, which I have here, and we have to find part A2, which is the cover for the gearbox itself. And like I said, step 19 is fairly simple. It calls for greasing of the pinion and spur gear, and then just the installation of the cover itself. So let's do that right now. I will grease up the pinion and spur gear. All right, so I've now applied grease to the spur and pinion gear. Applied very liberally. Don't be afraid of it. And next step, we install the gearbox cover over top pinion and the spur gear with 3 by 10 millimeter self-tapping screws. All right, that's done. And that is step 19, the gearbox with motor completely assembled. There you go. Done. Step 19 is finished. All right, so on to step 20. Now step 20 calls for attaching the rear lower arms to the gearbox that we've just finished assembling. Now, what's required according to the manual, we need two 3 by 46 millimeter screw pins right here. We need the 2 lower suspension arms. These are part numbers D6. Now when you first get them off the sprue, there's As shown in the instruction manual, there's a couple of pieces here and here that you're supposed to cut off and discard, which I've already done. So that's that part there, that part there. Now, it's fairly straightforward. Using the screw pins, you attach these to either side of the gearbox. Not a big issue. However, if you've seen my previous video, I talked about not wanting to use the screw pins that were included with the kit. These screw pins are not stainless steel, they're just treated metal, and they rust out relatively quickly. And given that this is a buggy, it will see some rather adverse and harsh conditions during regular use, so I'd rather avoid the issue of having to deal with rusted screw pins. So I'm not using the screw pins that are included in the kit, and instead I'm using stainless steel shafts. Now, the shaft set that I'm using is Tamiya Hop-Up 54613, and again, you'll have seen this kit or this hop-up set in the previous video. This is not a trick that I figured out on my own. This is actually something that I saw on another YouTube video by Mark Bryan RC during his DT-03 build. So we're going to be using 2 of the stainless steel shafts in this kit. So let's get them out of this thing right now. All right, so these are the 2 stainless steel shafts that I'll be using. These are 48.5 millimeters in length. The screw pins, if you remember, they're 46 millimeters in length, so close enough. I may need to use some shims after I put these on, but that's not a big deal. I can always add them on a little bit later. But these are what I'm going to be using in place of the screw pins that came with the kit. So first things first, whenever dealing with one of these stainless steel shafts, you want to install the included E-clips on one end of each one first before you get into it. So let's do that right now. All right, so the stainless steel shafts are now ready. I've installed one E-clip on either end. So let's start with the first one. So again, referring to the instructions, we can see with the motor behind, the arm will go in like so. Shaft goes through, and the end sticking out. And in fact, it doesn't look like we're going to need any sort of shim or anything to that effect. I think it's just going to be close enough. Just now need to get the E-clip installed. Again, very fiddly work, so take your time. Good. And that's the first arm installed. Now I'll just go ahead and do the second one. And that is the second suspension arm installed on the gearbox. And that concludes step 20. All right, so now we're on to step 21. Now step 21 involves attaching the rear upper arms to the gearbox, as well as attaching the drive cups on either side of the actual differential itself. So we'll leave that one for a second. Let's go on to the rear arms at first. Now, the rear arms call for 2 3x32mm screw pins, as well as the upper arms themselves. However, again, much like the lower arms, I don't want to use the screw pins that are included with the kit because of rust. I'd rather avoid that issue, so I'm not going to be using these. Beyond that, again, if you watch the first part or the previous video, you know that I've already gone ahead and opted for the DT-03 for a full turnbuckle set. This is kit number 54572. And this turnbuckle set includes a set of adjustable upper links that completely replace the upper arms that come with the DT-03 kit. Now, I've already gone ahead and assembled the two rear upper turnbuckle links, and this is what they look like. I'll give you guys an idea of what they look like there. Now, I should mention, if you do decide to go with this kit, a little tip when assembling these things, and that is to get a set of vice grips and sort of hold the adjuster nut here in the center while you're screwing the adjuster cups on either side while you're screwing them on. The reason why I say using a set of vice grips as opposed to the small wrench that's actually included with the turnbuckle set is that this little wrench really doesn't do a great job sort of holding the turnbuckle secure and steady while you're actually screwing the adjusters into place. If you have a better quality wrench, that might work better, but I strongly suggest using something like vice grips. Even needle nose pliers really won't hold enough given the amount of pressure you have to actually apply in order to get these adjuster cups into place. So little tip, use a set of vice grips when you're actually assembling these two. And again, you'll notice the way they are, one drive cup actually faces up while the other one faces the other way. Don't know if you guys can sort of see that on video. I hope that comes out, but that's how they are. Now, with that said, going with these, you completely eliminate the use of any sort of screw pins, and instead you use regular machine screws and balls to attach the actual arms. So let me get into that right now. Let's attach these. So to attach these upper turnbuckle arms, the instructions call for using a 3x18mm screw along with what looks like a 1mm washer or spacer, shim, I guess. So that's installed like that. There, hope you guys can see that right there. So I've just installed that. And on the far end, you attach the ball nut. So let me do that right now. So that is one side installed right there. I'll get on to installing the other side. All right, so that side is now done as well. And now we attach the upper turnbuckle arms simply by pushing them into place. There's the one. And the second one. And that's the upper control arms. The adjustable upper control arms are now in place. And next we install the drive cups. Now, the kit itself actually calls for part N2 on either side to be installed. Now these are sort of metal shafts encased in a plastic drive cup. This is what came with the actual DT-03 kit itself. But because you guys just watched me a few minutes ago install or build and install the ball diff setup, or ball diff differential in the gearbox, I won't be using these, and instead the ball diff itself comes with its own drive cups, and those are the drive cups for the ball diff. So these are the two that I'll be using instead of the kit drive cups. So put those aside, and these go into the differential. And one goes on one side and one goes on the other. And I believe that's that. So now the drive cups are now installed. Not sure you guys can see them, but they're on there. And that's where they are. That's step 21 complete. All right, so now we're on to step number 22, and step 22 has us attaching the rear axles to our gearbox and lower rear suspension assembly. In order to do that, it calls for 2 plastic bushings, but of course in our case we're using bearings, so we've got 2 bearings here. Calls for 2 3x32mm screw pins and 2 3x22mm screw pins. Now, again, because I'm using the adjustable upper control arms, I won't need to be using any of the screw pins, and I'm going to be swapping out the screw pins that were meant for the lower suspension with stainless steel shafts, much like I've done already with the inboard side of the rear suspension. Of course, we also now have to bring in parts number B2, which are the outboard, I guess, rear suspension knuckles. Right, so those are there, right there. And we also have to use the kit supplied drive cups. Now these kit supplied drive cups, these are the outboard drive cups. The inboard drive cups, as I said earlier, we won't be using because the ball differential already has its own drive cups. However, I have just come across what I think is a bit of a problem. So these are the kit supplied dog bones, and as you can see, they're large, beefy plastic units. I believe that there is actually a metal shaft that's actually encased within the plastic drive shafts. Now, many people say that the kit supplied drive shafts are actually quite strong. They're very robust and they put up with a lot of abuse. However, the issue that I have right now is that they will not fit into the drive cups of the ball differential. Don't know if you guys can see that, but they do not fit into the actual drive cup itself. So this is a little bit of a setback. However, with that said, I do actually have on order right now a set of steel heavy-duty CVD drive shafts intended for this vehicle, which would actually be replacing the stock dog bones. In fact, not only will they be replacing the stock dog bones, but they'll also be replacing the outer dog bones, kit supplied dog bones as well. So for the rest of this part of the build, I'm going to move ahead without installing the dog bones. I will be using these just for illustrative purposes, and then when the CVDs arrive that I've ordered up and hopefully they don't take too long, I'll simply remove the upper control arm and actually install the CVDs themselves. So won't take long, but unfortunately you won't see them in this build. So let's get into assembling the rear knuckles. So first things first, push one of the bearings inside. As you can see, there's one bearing in there. Second one, push the second bearing inside. There we go. Then of course, the drive cups. These are the kit supplied drive cups. Now, according to the instructions here, they show that you grease this shaft before you put it in. Again, if I was using the plastic bushings that came with the kit, that would be necessary, but because we're using bearings, that isn't really required. So just slide that in, and that part is now done. Spins very, very nicely, very freely. And same with the other side. Again, no need for any of the grease. So that's those two ready to go. They're there and there. So now, in this particular case, I need to first, I'll install the fasteners needed to attach the upper control arms, which consists of two 3x12mm machine screws, along with the two ball heads to accompany. They go into the actual knuckles themselves. So let's get into that right now. All right, so now that the rear knuckles are complete and ready to be installed, we now need the two stainless steel shafts for either side of the lower suspension arms. Now, again, going back to the stainless steel shaft set that we used earlier, we're going to be using two 32mm stainless steel shafts along with their accompanying E-clips. Now, as before, I'm going to install one E-clip on either side and then slip them in, and then install the remaining E-clip on the other side once they are installed. So let's get into that right now. All right, so now the stainless steel shafts have an E-clip on either end. So now I can go ahead and actually attach the rear knuckles to the lower suspension arm. So let's do this side first. Slide the stainless steel shaft in. Into the rear knuckle. And then, now this rear shaft will need a shim. I don't have any handy right now, but I will be ordering some and I will install it later. But for the time being, I'm just going to go ahead and install another E-clip on the end. All right, and that side is done. And then the upper turnbuckle installs like that. So that side is finished. Now let's just do the same thing on the other side. All right, so now the rear axles are installed along with the upper control arms. And that brings us to the end of step 22. All right, so we're now on to step 23. Now, step 23 calls for attaching the receiver switch. Well, in this case, it's actually going to be the switch that's attached to the ESC. And that gets attached to its own mount, which is part number M8. Now, if you guys recall from the previous video, the M sprue, I'm using the reinforced hop-up option M sprue, or M parts, reinforced M parts. That's Tamiya hop-up option number 54816. And this piece here, which is the switch mount, is from that set. So we'll need this piece here. We're also going to need 4 3x10mm topping screws, 2 2x10mm machine screws, 2 2mm washers, switch cover, which is actually sort of a rubber piece, obviously meant to be sort of weather protected. You can see it's kind of flexible. And then ultimately the switch itself. Now, according to the instructions here, it actually shows it attached to the receiver, but in reality, it's actually part of the ESC. Now, this is the kit supplied ESC. This is the TBLE-02S. This is sort of the standard ESC that Tamiya includes with many of their current kits. And this is the one that I'm going to be using for my build. So this is the switch that I need to use, and I need to remove these 2 screws before I go forward. So let me do that right now. All right, so I've taken the 2 screws out of the switch itself, and the faceplate actually came off with it. Didn't realize there was a separate faceplate here, but there is one that's on the ESC, but you don't really need to use it, so this one comes off. And according to the instructions, the switch cover goes on, like so. Nothing special about that. And then the switch and the switch cover get I guess, sort of threaded through into the mount, and then we take a washer and a screw, machine screw, and drive it through and into the switch itself. So here we go. All right, so the screw is now mounted into its holder, or sorry, the switch is now mounted into its switch holder, and now this gets mounted to our newly assembled gearbox, and that goes on like so, as you can see, and it'll be held in place by the 4 3x10mm tapping screws. So let's do that right now. All right, so now that the switch mount is now installed on the gearbox, as you can see, now the switch mount is installed on the gearbox. Step 23 is now complete. All right, so we're now on to step 24. 24. Now step 24 involves attaching the gearbox assembly that we've just finished off to the chassis itself. Now we actually get to bring the chassis back in and set the gearbox off to the side for just a few minutes. Now, in order to actually do that, the very first thing we need to do is we need to attach these two chassis braces to the chassis itself where the gearbox is going to be mounted. These two braces themselves look like this. These are parts C3 and they're identical. These are the kit parts. However, as has been the theme with this entire video, I will not be using the kit parts, and instead I have opted for Tamiya hop-up option. This is 54566, and these are aluminum gearbox braces. Now, I'm not 100% completely convinced that these parts were actually going to make a big difference, but the way I looked at it, and the reason why I went with these, is because they are where the gearbox actually attaches to the chassis. So my guess is that that particular area on the chassis takes a fair bit of abuse with the gearbox kind of bouncing around. It's a big sort of heavy assembly. So as far as I'm concerned, you know, using metal braces as opposed to the plastic kit braces would probably be a good idea, and for the cost, these were actually not that much money, so I went ahead with this. So let's get these out of the package and get them set in place and ready to install the gearbox into position. Now, in addition to these braces, we're also going to need two 3x12 millimeter tapping screws, as well as four 3x12 millimeter countersunk screws as well. So let's open this up, get the braces in position, and get ready to go. All right, so I've got the two chassis braces. The way they're installed, you'll notice if you take a look at them, these are very nice Tamiya parts. Beautiful quality. You'll notice that on this side it's somewhat indented, whereas the top side is flat. The, I guess, indented or recessed side faces the chassis, so they get installed this way and this way. Good. Now, if you do end up going with the kit pieces, they are slightly different. If you take a look at them, the kit pieces actually have a bevel on one side, whereas the hop-up parts don't have any bevel at all. And this is important to note when you go through the instructions, the way these get installed. This one is on the rear and this one is closer to the front, and they're oriented in this sort of way. So they have this little sort of tab section kind of indicating how they need to be installed. You don't need to worry about that when you use the hop-up parts. So that's what I'm putting on mine. Now that these are sort of resting in place, the next step is to take the entire gearbox assembly and set it in place as well. Now, according to the instructions, this tab piece here slides into a hole right here on the chassis, and that should help locate it once it's into position. And I believe that's it. So the two 3x12 millimeter self-tapping screws, one goes in on one side and one goes in on the other side. Let's put this one in first, and then the other one goes in here. All right, so that's the first 2 screws installed on either side to hold the gearbox in place. Now we install the 4 countersunk screws underneath. All right, so now lower screws have been installed. All right, so now with the gearbox fully installed, that brings us to the end of step 24. And it brings us to the end of this build video. If you found any of this useful, or even mildly entertaining, please feel free to hit that like button. And if you want to continue following along with the build of my Tamiya DT-03 Racing Fighter, which personally I think is coming along rather well despite the small setback with the dog bones, but like I said, I've got a set of CVDs on their way, and once they do arrive, it'll be a quick job to disconnect the upper control arms and slide those in without much issue at all. But if you do want to follow along with the rest of this build, feel free to subscribe and hit that notification button so you'll be notified when I upload the next video. Thanks again for watching, guys. We'll catch you in the next one. Bye.